Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. If you've been paying attention to the news recently, you may have noticed that many of the big stories revolve around Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. If you've been paying attention to the news recently, you may have noticed that many of the big stories revolve around questions of race. Increasingly in this country, race is the headline. Just this week, Roseanne Barr was fired and her show was canceled on ABC after she tweeted an attack on Valerie Jarrett that many described as racist. Starbucks, the coffee retailer, closed more than 8,000 of its retail stores in order to re-educate its white employees about their unconscious racism. Meanwhile, a bar in Portland, Oregon hosted a reparations happy hour where non-white patrons drank for free. Over in cable newsland, MSNBC aired an hour-long primetime special that not only attacked racism, but also engaged in it by stereotyping an entire group of people based on their skin color. Here's a selection from that.
The gentrifiers of today, their parents or their grandparents, ran away from the city to get away from black and brown folk. And now their children and their grandchildren are saying, oh, the suburbs, there's only so many Olive Gardens I can go to, so I need to go back to the city and get my life in the city. But when I do that, I need to have my hot yoga studio and my pottery studio and my stuff represented. And if you intrude on that, I will then call the police.
Well, more and more, it feels like racial division is the subtext of virtually everything in this country. Even topics that seem unrelated to ethnicity suddenly are racially fraught. The effect of all that is a deeply angry and divided nation, but also, you may have noticed, a terrified one. Many Americans are scared to say what they really think about just about anything. One false word and you could be denounced on Twitter and lose your livelihood. It happens. We see it all the time. Best just to smile and nod and hope the witch hunt passes. How long do we have to live this way? And how did we get here in the first place? Joining us now is someone who has paid attention closely for a long time, Peter Kirsanow, a lawyer who serves on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and has written a new thriller called Second Strike, which I can tell you firsthand is excellent. Peter, thanks a lot for joining us.
Always my pleasure, Tucker.
So there's something strange going on. Even as the country becomes much more diverse, and that was a trend that we were promised would make the country more harmonious, the country seems much more on edge about questions of race. What is going on?
Well, I think several things are going on, but the overriding thing is a political narrative that's driven to enhance one argument or the side of one particular side. And it has its genesis in two things. First is the political imperative of getting Democrats elected, chiefly.
Yes.
And so we have a lot of this division on the basis of race because there are no policy prescriptions anymore. If you've listened very closely, you don't hear any workable policy prescriptions, or very few workable policy prescriptions, but what you hear a lot of is identity politics. I've been on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights in 17 years, and in that 17 years, we haven't had more lucid conversations about race or identity. They have gotten increasingly sophomoric, they've gotten increasingly opaque, and they're driven by an ahistorical narrative, one that doesn't have, or very little bearing on what truly happened in the United States of America. Look, the fact of the matter is that in my lifetime, matters of race and racial discriminations have gotten demonstrably better in ways that we could never even imagine. If you look at the interaction between individuals of various races today, they've never been better, individuals of races. But when you come to the interaction between groups, it's become hostile and toxic, and it's a function of trying to get certain groups to have an allegiance to a certain movement or certain party for a political imperative.
May I stop you there and just get back up for a second to address something that you said that I'd never thought of? The conversation is increasingly general and less specific. So whereas 30 years ago, people might say, in order to close the achievement gap in standardized testing, we need to put more money into Head Start, for example. Now the conversation is, this group is bad, it has always been bad, it will never get better. Why are we hearing fewer solutions than we used to hear?
Well, I think for a couple of reasons. One, again, is that political imperative, because solutions augur against having a political advantage. But I think it's also because there's a tendency on the part of some to shout down others, to cast others as the other. And again, that's for political imperative. but you're
Right.
afraid to say things that are demonstrably true. To give you one example, a couple of weeks ago we had a hearing at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, all-day hearing, people from the Justice Department, Police Chiefs Association, you name it. Everybody in the world was there and the usual groups were there. It was a hearing on hate crimes because of the ostensible spike in hate crimes since Trump has been elected. But facts are stubborn things, and when you take a look at the data, and when I ask questions of this, after everyone made these grand pronouncements about how horrible and horrific the spike in hate crimes is, we had no hard evidence of such spike, and the best data on this comes from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which has shown for the last 30 years there has been a decline in hate crimes. There's been a decline in all manner of discrimination for more than 30 years. Yet we have greater sensitivity, heightened sensitivity, and you have to ask yourself this, why this is the case. And I think to some extent it's because it helps the agenda of certain groups, of certain parties, of certain individuals.
So you keep hearing that we need to have an honest conversation on race, and I'm always for conversations, particularly for honest ones. But I wonder, after all these conversations, if the country is becoming more divided, maybe that's not evidence that it's not working. Do we need to talk less about race or more about race? Does the conversation idea hold up to scrutiny?
Two things. One is, Tucker, I disagree that we're having conversations. We always hear that we need to have a conversation, but what we get is harangues, and the harangues usually come from one side,
right.
And most decent people kind of duck their heads and watch out for incoming fire. They don't want to get caught in the crossfire, and you know, if you go to colleges, law schools, almost any institution of higher learning, and frankly, K through 12, there are only certain acceptable opinions that you can have. There are students who are punished, and they know this, and they know precisely how to react in the context of a classroom debate ostensibly on race. There's only one acceptable opinion, and you're not allowed to offer other opinions, and that doesn't forward the conversation. And one other point.
No, and it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help anybody. I can see why they try to shout you down, by the way, but I'm glad that you came. Thanks very much. Peter Christenow, great to see you.
Thanks, Tucker.
As we just told you, Starbucks closed its retail stores this week in order to re-educate its employees about racism. The assumption, of course, is that Starbucks' white employees are racist simply because they're white. But isn't that a racist assumption itself? Why is Starbucks wading into this topic anyway? Isn't it supposed to be a coffee shop? Professor Jason Nichols has been following the story since the beginning, and he joins us now. Professor, thanks for coming on. So I thought Peter Christenow said something really interesting a second ago, which is that we talk less about solutions and more in general terms. So just to give you one example, if the people who run Starbucks are upset about the racial climate in the country, and it's fair to be upset about that, then why do they have so few stores in black neighborhoods? I think the biggest concentration of black New Yorkers is Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn. I think there's one Starbucks there. You go to the Upper East Side, Starbucks in every corner. So if they really want to make things different, why aren't they opening Starbucks in black neighborhoods? Wouldn't that do a lot more than these conversations they're having?
Well, I think if you want to talk about that, I would say more, even better than that would be employing more African American and Latino baristas and managers. I think that's probably a better solution rather than just placing them in their neighborhoods. Because in many cases, that might actually lead to displacing some mom and pop shops and coffee shops that are independently owned, particularly ones by African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans. So I would agree with you there that there are also other substantive things that they can do, but I think that this is absolutely a beginning, and of course this was just supposed to start a dialogue, not supposed to solve all of the world's problems in 4 hours.
But it's clearly an example of something that I've noticed a lot of recently, which is collective blame. The idea that because you look a certain way, you're responsible for a certain set of historical sins, you must have a certain set of attitudes, which is, of course, a racist assumption by definition. And so I wonder if you're going to approach this question, why not do it with the true assumption that racism is a human problem? Bias, hatred, evil, they're human problems committed by all people, not unique to one group. But that's not what Starbucks is doing at all, right?
Well, I think one of the things is that that's not Starbucks' experience. Starbucks had the arrest of those two gentlemen and other experiences of bias, and it seems like it's pretty one-sided. So they wanted to address that, and I don't think that what they wanted to do was...
So wait a second. First of all...
No, hold on, Tucker. Let me just finish this one point. I think one of the things that they wanted to do was to create a dialogue between people of different backgrounds. It wasn't about blame, and I think that's one of the things that's missing oftentimes when we have these discussions, Tucker, is that people think that just because you want to have a dialogue about race, and yes, history matters and all these things, you know, I think we need to think of it that way, that we're just going to have an open exchange of ideas and have an open dialogue.
I'm sorry, that's false. What our kids are being taught and what Starbucks is teaching us is that certain groups are more prone to racism than others, and that's a lie, as you know, because all people are fundamentally the same in that they're capable of great good and great bad, and racism is one of the great bads. But they're all capable of that. There's no group has a monopoly on racism in this or any other country, and to suggest otherwise is itself racist, right?
Tucker, here's the thing. Here's what I would say is that I do think that groups have their biases, absolutely, but the difference is some groups have the power to enforce those biases and make things more difficult for others and discriminate against other people.
Well, people don't always act as groups. I mean, wait, hold on. That assumption itself, I mean, maybe I'm the liberal here, but I mean, groups don't act according to like directives, like all white people, all black people, all American Indians don't get some message from HQ. Individuals act as individuals, like a lot, mostly. And people are capable, all people, regardless of color, of racism. But that's not the message that Starbucks is teaching, which again is itself racist.
So Tucker, when have two white men been arrested in a Starbucks for being white? If you can tell me that.
I don't know for being white. I mean, I don't know what that means.
So
I mean, for okay. Look, the point is that yes, you've had a lot of anti-black racism, but that doesn't mean that everyone who's white shares a special burden of racism, because that assumption is itself racist. So to get beyond this morass, you need to acknowledge that human sin is universal and that people aren't responsible for the actions of people who happen to look like them. Because that's collective punishment and collective guilt, and it's wrong, right?
Again, Tucker, I think you have inferred more from this than I think Starbucks is actually saying.
Oh, no, I haven't. No, come on, Professor. Let's not be disingenuous. I'm not inferring anything. I'm listening carefully to what I'm being told.
Okay, but there's anti-black racism, and when we're addressing that, sometimes that can come from anybody of any background. So what we're trying to do is address some of the issues of anti-blackness, immigrant sentiment. We're trying to address that, but we're trying to address that for all people. There are times, believe it or not, when African Americans discriminate against other African Americans based on the assumptions that they have. So I think, addressing bias and trying to be anti-bias, we're not trying to say that this is just white people or,
Well, no, of course you are. That's exactly what you're saying, and you know it. And
that is not what
that's exactly what you're saying. That's exactly what Starbucks is saying. It's exactly what my kids' teachers are telling them every day. Let's be honest. I guess we can't. Professor, great to see you.
Thank you. Absolutely. Always great, Tucker. Thanks.